Hello? Hello? Is anyone out there? Welcome
Hello?
to... Hi, Jamie.
Hi.
Hi, Ernie.
Hi, Tessa.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Hello, listeners. Hello, world. Hello, world. If anyone knows what that is from, or what it means, good on you. Cool. Okay. So I am going to introduce our guest today. Also, I introduce her when we start getting into the meat of the podcast. But this episode is one that's very exciting for me to release. I've been looking forward to speaking with this guest. The guest is Danielle Dulsky, who's a multi-talented professional in the realm of witchery, mysticism, magic, ritual, and heathenism. Heathenism is a topic that we dive into on this podcast episode, and it's really interesting to get Danielle's take on it. So what I want to do, though, before we jump into the episode is there's a couple of things that come up for me when I talk to people who are experts in this area. I often think about the words magic and witch. And I think those two words are highly charged, and they come with like a lot of, I don't know if I want to say emotion, but they might come with, maybe they come with emotion for some of us, but they might also come with like these preconceived notions of what it means to either A, be a witch, or B, practice magic. And when I think about these two concepts, I always think, it feels kind of almost like to me like this intangible thing, this ethereal thing that I want to figure out how to harness in a practical sense, or maybe in a modern day sense. And certainly there are all kinds of books out there that give you actual rituals that you can practice in your daily life. And Danielle is one of those authors. And in her many books, today we'll talk about Bones and Honey on the podcast, but she has also written some grimoires. That's kind of a hard word to say. How do you say grimoire? Right? I don't know. Does anyone know how to pronounce it?
I don't personally, unfortunately.
Grimoire.
I think you're doing it right. I think it is Grimoire.
Okay. Anyways, so grimoire, I believe, is kind of like almost like a witch's journal or spell book. But that's something that I feel like is a very practical, tangible way to start to think about. If I ascribe to being a witch, or if I consider myself a witch and I want to practice magic, that might be an avenue to go. That might be a resource that I have. So I wanted to hear from both you, Jamie and Ernie, when I say, or when someone says witch and when someone says magic, what comes up for you?
Well, when I think of like those words, like I usually think of like something mystical, or I usually think of like rituals and like a supernatural like practice or something. But I feel like maybe that's much more of like a stereotyped sort of like idea that I have, considering that like personally I haven't met too many people who like practice that or anything. So I feel like for me I have like a very limited like experience like with that. But I feel like it could be like a much broader sense as well.
Yeah. Totes. Ernie?
So thank you. I just waiting to make sure. So when I think of the friends that I've had usually refer to themselves as Wiccan instead of witch, and I wonder if they do that to avoid this stereotype, because when I think of a witch, or in that regard, I think of somebody who's connected with the world, who's more about the ethereal, and they use the magic in the sense of connecting to the world around them, as opposed to the old stereotype where a witch was, you burned witches at the stake, but and it's always dark. But a Wiccan really tries to make sure that they promote, to me, what I think of as positive energy of awareness. And then the magic is the energy that they use. It's their ability to harness the positive energy around us and kind of bring it together.
Oh, I like that definition. Okay, so one is the subject and one is the object, kind of like
Yes.
the tool. I like that. Yeah, and I like thinking about it as an energy, and I certainly think there's room for both light and dark and a feeling of, I don't know, I don't want to say good or bad. I don't really think of it in those terms, but lightness and darkness. Another thing that Danielle and I talk about is the dark night of the soul and how important that shadow work is. You really can't have You can't really have one without the other. I always think of this, I'm sure I've said this a million times on this podcast, but I always think of this poem by Khalil Gibran. And the line is something along the lines of, you can't have joy without sorrow. They go hand in hand. And when one sits at your bedside, the other one sits at your headboard. And you really can't know what joy is without having the contrast of knowing what sorrow is. So I think, what Ernie, what you said is making me think of is, I like to think of this as an invitation to practice wholeness. We like to compartmentalize things, and I don't know if we like to compartmentalize things, but maybe it's more of like a unconscious bias where it's like, oh, I want everything to be neat and tidy, and I want everything to be joyful and peaceful. But our human existence is messy. Oh my God, it's messy. And I think that's part of what makes our human existence so beautiful is the mess, because we can see in comparison to the chaos when something falls into place and when something works out, it's like, oh, I have so much appreciation for that because I have that contrast to compare it against. And if we didn't have that contrast, like if everything was beautiful and lovely all the time, would we really even know what beauty was? What do you think?
Oh, no, I don't think so, because like I was thinking about that because it's always a cycle. Like you have to have like not just like that linear like up and down, but it's just like part of that like cycle where it's like, well, you're just at this part of like the circle and everything. Because if something's consistent, you're obviously gonna just like I think about that because like we live, or at least I live in a really beautiful place. And I always think about like it's really beautiful, but there's other like beauty as well. I don't know where, or like whenever, oh man, like whenever there's an up and down, like you have to have like the bad to have like to recognize the good and everything. And so like with that, like there's just like part of a cycle. And yeah.
Yeah, I like the image of a cycle. A circle is complete, a circle is whole. And yeah, you might go through those swings where it's like, that feels really good. That doesn't feel so good, but it's going to come back around.
Yeah, because you have to have the contrast to be able to see them. So
definitely.
I like the idea of a cycle as well, because I think it gets you away from, like you said, Tessa, good and bad. It's not good and bad. It comes out as positive, negative. And I think that's what when you used to think of some of the, like the witch, it was always like bad, evil, dark arts. And then it was, well, the good is championing, as opposed to, are you channeling positive energy or channeling negative energy? And the cycle goes back and forth. You don't know it's a good day if you're not having a bad day. And like Jamie said, I love that imagery. You don't really know what beauty is if you haven't been on another side, but then there are many different kinds of beauty, and there are many different kinds of positive energy. And you can either take a negative thing and make it positive, or you can take a positive thing and make it into another positive. So I kind of like that.
I also think that this kind of thought process is helpful in terms of being able to hold paradox simultaneously. So when I say that, I mean hold the idea that something can be simultaneously good and bad. And I think that makes us more compassionate human beings with one another. I think about, I had this conversation over on the Radically Loved podcast with Sa DeSimone, who is talking about the work that he does. He works with unhoused youth in LA. And he was talking about this idea of paradox being such a beautiful thing to kind of like behold in situations where something can seem really dire, or something can sound really bad, or some sort of life circumstance can be just terrible on the surface. It can look terrible on the surface. And so he was describing his work going into the unhoused youth camps and talking to these people and just getting like a day in the life of. And he's like describing this one person who says, you know, surrounded by whatever it is they're surrounded by, not having basic needs met, in essence, like not having a roof over your head, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, but also this person being able to say, I'm looking forward to this in my life. This is going really well. I have hope because of X, Y, and Z. So being able to do both, hold that good and bad simultaneously, I think makes us more compassionate human beings. All right. So with that said, without further ado, I am just so excited to bring you a conversation with Danielle Dulsky. I hope you enjoy. Here we go. Hey everyone, welcome to Outside the Studio. We have a very special guest on the show today, Danielle Dulsky, which is a multi-time author, and we're going to be talking a lot about her new book on this episode. It's called Bones and Honey, a Heathen Prayer Book, and I'll hold up the cover, which is lovely and beautiful and just such a nice resource to have had in my life as we head into 2024. Such a wild year. It feels like so much is happening. It feels like there's just so much chaos and uncertainty in the world. And so, yeah, what else? Danielle, she's the author. I mean, like I said, multi-time author, The Holy Wild, Seasons of Moon and Flame, Woman Most Wild, The Holy Wild Grimoire, and then most recently Bones and Honey, which is the one that I held up. Heather is also a visionary painter, poet, storyteller, and Word Witch. She teaches internationally and has facilitated circles, embodiment trainings, communal spell work, and seasonal rituals since 2007. She is the founder of the Hag School and believes in the emerging power of wild collectives and sudden circles of curious dreamers, cunning witches, and rebellious artists in healing our ailing world, which, yeah, like I said, is so needed right now. Yes, this year. Yes, please. Danielle, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show and for putting your good work out into the world. How are you today?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Tessa. I'm well today. This is my month of kind of calming down and thinking about my life for a little bit. And so I always schedule my dark night of the soul around my birthday. So that's where I'm at, but it's good.
Yeah.
If it's a scheduled dark night of the soul, it's good.
It's like you can prepare for it.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I love, my question is always like, well, I ask a lot of questions about like hitting rock bottom. And when I hear someone say dark night of the soul, I kind of think of that. I don't think they're interchangeable. They're not necessarily synonymous with one another, but I also love you know, the willingness to do shadow work, the dark work, the willingness to embrace things that maybe not feel so like, oh yeah, I want to put that out into the world, and but so necessary. You know, it's the yin and the yang, it's the dark and the light. We can't have one without the other. The joy and the sorrow is one of my favorite poets, Khalil Gibran, writes about.
Mm-hmm.
So will you tell me a little bit about how, you know, what does that entail for you? Do you mind sharing your dark night of the soul and preparing for that?
I don't mind sharing. I start talking about it a lot in maybe September because I work a lot with paradox magic, especially in autumn. And one of the hallmarks of paradox magic is you sort of think about your two big inner contradictory roles. And it feels like if I am this, then I can't be that at the same time. And so in autumn, when you hold the tension between those two roles, which for most people come down to something around stability versus freedom, or roots versus wings, or provider versus artist, witch scientist, something like that, almost always comes down to like those two types of roles. And you hold the tension between them in order to have this kind of power source erupt in this very tantric way between these two opposites, like the click between two opposites. But with paradox magic, it's the roles that you play. And so for me in autumn, I began thinking about like what feels like my big paradox this year. And then I sort of give those roles mythic names so it feels interesting and compelling and not depressing. So for me this year, and maybe to a certain extent every year, my brighter role was the shining story happy witch who you see before you, who's, you know, the one that is kind of out in the world promoting her work and all of that. And then there's the weeping snow hag, who I always become around the end of December going through early spring. And, you know, she's the one who incubates all of the art and writes the books and, you know, figures out what the really dark orientation is for the year, but it's like the primordial womb from which the shining story happy witch is born. So when I'm planning for my dark night of the soul, I'm thinking about that, like the sort of anguish of the artist and being in a place of solitude that isn't compelling, that nobody would find interesting necessarily, or like it wouldn't make a good reality show. And people that wouldn't necessarily pay the weeping snow hag to teach them anything. And yet I really do need to be her for a little bit. So yeah, so that it kind of gives my dark night of the soul a place to land, not necessarily allowing me to prepare for every aspect of it, but a lot of the darker, gnarlier pieces can sort of have a place to live when I do it that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, and what I love about what you just said is that it's kind of seasonal, and that makes me think of like the necessary death in the winter of, you know, the incubation period in the winter, so that when spring rolls around, we can rebirth and there is new creative energy. And then, you know, I thought I heard you say that's when you write your books, is during the dark night of the soul.
Yeah, if not write the whole thing, it's certainly when I usually conceive of what the new one will be and think about what I'm feeling called to write about. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. So were you journaling or is this kind of more like something that you just let percolate in a
Well,
thought?
I write every day. So if it's journaling, you know, that I'm writing things that nobody necessarily will read, or I know that this might turn into something. I don't always know that going into it. I'll kind of start writing and then see like, oh, this is something nobody needs to know about, or oh, this is something that really could turn into something bigger that maybe I do want to be witnessed. So yeah, and I do track it, and I'm a big fan of tracking my dreams, which are always really fertile, you know, no matter what time of year it is. But especially, I think, in my dark night of the soul time, my dreams are really prophetic, and I can kind of tell like what I'm being oriented toward if I'm really good and disciplined about writing the dreams down. So yeah, that's kind of as far as my tracking what goes on in the dark night of the soul goes. But
that's great. I love that. Dream writing down dreams has been something I've been doing on and off over the years since adolescence, and you're inspiring me to start doing it again, because I used to wake up and be like and I would be like, where's my pen and paper? I have to write this down. This is a story. What I think too, I'm curious if you have any recurring dreams. I've done just a little bit of dream interpretation work with Clarissa Pinkola Estes. I can't remember what the name of that book is. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't. Does she have a dream book, or Women Who Run with the Wolves? You mean?
It's different than Run with the Wolves. It's the same author, but it is specific to dream interpretation. And she talks about she talks about all different types of dream archetypes, but one of them was about repetition in your dreams, in the form of like something that feels like you're running away from, running to, trying to fix or solve. And there is this one dream that I constantly have, and it's about being stuck in an elevator, and it always makes me feel like I'm going to suffocate and I can't breathe. I don't know why I'm telling you this.
Oh, because dream nerds recognize other dream nerds. That's why.
Yeah, maybe that's why. It's just such a visceral, you know, that visceral, like it feels like you're dying. It feels like, it feels like an untenable situation. Anyway.
Yeah, I have since childhood, my only recurring dream that has been like, I'm going to be 44, and I remember having this dream when I was like little,
Mhm.
is multiple tornado dreams. And I am usually trying to hide or get into the basement or something, but I can see that as I got older, I'm always now trying to save other people. Like there's this knowing that like I would be okay if I would just go hide in the basement on my own, but I have this feeling of like, but my kids and my neighbors and all of these other people, and I'm trying to get them to go into the basement that I know is safe and they won't listen to me. Like that's a common theme also. So yeah, I have these, and then I can see the tornadoes in the sky. So I have that dream maybe once every 3 months, like pretty consistently.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is very consistent.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, and I did a training with Dr. Estes where we did dream interpretation, and she was saying that there's this unresolved trauma in the recurring dreams, and you're just, until you get that lysis or resolution. So until I get all of the people to actually listen to me and come into the basement, I'm going to keep having that dream
Oh man.
because it does always end with me being like, well, I guess I failed. They didn't listen to me.
Yeah. That's yeah. Yeah, I've heard yeah. Okay. It's just like there's no easy way out of that one, right? It's the hard work that one has to do to process unresolved childhood trauma, it seems to me.
Yeah, if that's what it's from. I always blame the Wizard of Oz. But I did learn there's another dream guy that I follow. I think his name is Dr. Stephen Eisenstadt, and he has a really interesting practice that I'm not trained in, so I won't be able to speak about it too much, but he does have this recommendation that in real life, like when you're awake, you go back into the dream. So you would essentially build yourself an elevator and you would recreate this dream, but then you would force yourself out of it, or whatever you're supposed to do to get that resolution at the end of the dream. You would do that in real life and then
Oh.
see if that shows up in the dream time, if it's changed it somehow.
Oh,
So I don't know how I'll
okay.
recreate my multiple tornado dreams.
Yeah. You're gonna have to get a lot of really powerful fans. Lots of powerful fans.
And actors.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, how funny. Ugh. The last thing I will say about that is if there's no other choice for me other than to take an elevator, because I will always opt for the stairs, then take an elevator in real life. Sometimes when I step onto an elevator, I'll have this like quick flash of being like, wait, is this a dream or am I awake? And then I'll tell
Yeah.
myself, oh, you're awake. You're awake. Okay. You're okay. You're okay. And it's so interesting because for a second, I'm like, wait a minute. Did I just fall asleep?
I know. And we don't know. What if this is the dream? We
Right?
don't know. I
Yeah.
think about it all the time when my dogs dream, because it's like I can see
Mhm.
that they're dreaming. I know they wake up and they're like, "What happened?" Because they don't have a word for dream or like know what that is like we do.
Yeah.
Like they think they just lived that, and now
Yeah.
suddenly they're here.
And then they'll look up at you and they'll be like,
Yeah.
they look so confused, poor babies. Well, okay. I do have some questions for you about the book. And so I want to say the title again, Bones and Honey, a Heathen Prayer Book. And I wanted to pull out the word heathen. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about heathen in terms of, the title, why you chose that word, what does heathen mean? Let's unpack the title a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. Heathen is a great word. So, in addition to being a dream nerd, I'm also a huge word nerd. And I love when there's the etymology or the word story that's just wrapped up in this one word. You have like a whole lifetime wrapped up in this like 4 letters or however long the word is. So, heathen means dweller on the heath. And heath was, where sort of the last holdouts in the Celtic lands, especially who didn't want to be colonized or Christianized, they lived on the heath. And so it really means to live on untamed ground and kind of refuse to be beholden to laws that you don't agree with or belief systems that you don't agree with necessarily. So that's where heathen comes from. And so I think that the practice of if it is a practice, the identification as a heathen in some way, it means constantly questioning, like, who have I been told to be and who am I actually? And knowing that that's constantly shifting and changing. And like, to what extent do I need to, abide by the rules and the laws? And then to what extent can I get away with a lot? So I think it's a constant questioning of that and trying to figure out, how the best way to live for you is. And it changes, I think, throughout the phases of life. As a mother, there's certain things I can't get away with because I don't want my children to have to answer for me. And as they get older and they're on social media, that's become a thing. Because I am also on social media as maybe a non-traditional personality. But as they get older and they're sort of becoming their own thing, my older son is going to turn 18 and my younger son is about to turn 15. So, they're sort of become their own entities now. And I feel like I can get away with a lot more because I'm not having to necessarily be the mother of young children. That's just one example. But I think that the answer to what can, how much can you be an outlaw and live on the fringes and all of those things that seem really romantic, my answer 10 years ago would have been very different than it is now, where I feel like I can get away with quite a bit.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting juxtaposition to think about in terms of what can you do with all of this. I mean, it feels to me like everything's under the microscope, especially if you're in the industry like you and I, where a lot of our presence is on social media. And so whatever you say or do is seen by a lot of people and therefore maybe judged or interpreted in a certain way.
Yeah.
And so the idea of like, what can you get away with, or what's termed acceptable, and then you add kids into the mix and it's like, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but thank you for bringing that up.
And it makes it seem like I'm constantly trying to do something illegal. I'm not. But there is the tension between what's acceptable, whether that means by the overculture or by our smaller communities. There's things that are acceptable and things that aren't, and that keeps changing also. So it's a constant question of like, what do I really believe, and where's the borderland between what I believe and what I can get away with? And sometimes that borderland is really, really wide.
Yeah. Well, something you said a few minutes ago has me thinking about archetypes, which is like basically the way the book is structured is around archetypes. And I love talking about archetypes. There's so many different archetypes, but you were talking about in one of your dreams, getting people to listen to you, or like they wouldn't listen to you to get them to safety. And I was remembering too, like I have recurring dreams because I teach yoga about being in a classroom of people and they're all talking over me and nobody's listening to what I'm trying to teach or say. And as we're thinking about culture, the over culture, and the female voice, and thinking about archetypes, I'm wondering, if someone feels like or resonates with what you and I are saying around that, what archetype could we use to help strengthen, or do you use any of these archetypes to help strengthen that sense of like, my voice is valued and my voice is heard, and what I say matters, and that kind of
Yeah.
self-talk.
I think that in the book, it's or she is called is she the pagan warrioress or the heathen warriors? I don't remember, but she's the warrioress. And then there is, I think it's the pagan warrioress and then the heathen queen. So those two archetypes, the warrior archetype or the fighter archetype, and then the ruler archetype, which might be king or queen, prince or princess or whatever. That's the way they show up in the old stories. But when you weave those together, I think it helps us get it what you're talking about. Like the ruler archetype is the part of all of us that sets boundaries and also questions boundaries and figures out what not only how to be sovereign or seen as sovereign or witnessed as a sovereign by other people, but how to be sovereign kind of internally and sovereign also within the collective. So it's not necessarily about individualism. It's about being in charge of your own rules and your own boundaries for yourself, but also knowing that those are often co-created by the world and the world story. And then the warrior archetype is often about like the preparation for battle. So there's a great book on archetypes called What Stories Are You Living by Carol Pearson. I'm pretty sure that's the correct title and author. And in that book, she talks about, we think of the warrior archetype as being like the fighter, the sword raised and all of that. But really the hallmark of the warrior archetype is the preparation. So it's like, the part in Kill Bill when Uma Thurman is like training, right? And it's not necessarily when she actually starts killing everyone. So it's the preparation for a thing that's sort of and the very disciplined preparation for the thing that sort of is what makes the warrior. So I think to a certain extent, given this global underworld journey that we're all moving through right now, we are all embodying the warrior archetype. I mean, everybody kind of has a sense that like, yeah, we're still on this. It wasn't over in 2020. We're still on whatever this journey was. And so what is it that we're holding the tension of these times for? Like, why are we here? I'm constantly asking myself and my people, like, why are you here now? Like, if your soul chose to be here for this gnarliness, like, why? And I think that's an important question that the inner warrior is always asking. Why here? Why now? Why me?
Yeah. Do you ever feel like you can answer that question? I feel like I've been asking that since I remember the first conversation I had with my dad about that topic. I think I was about 7, and I want to say it was the Gulf War, and I couldn't really understand how, like, I lived in relative safety, and across the continent, across the globe, people were fearing for their lives. It was hard for me to reconcile between like, why am I lucky? Why am I here? Then what is my purpose when other people are, just trying to survive or not surviving at all? Do you ever feel like you come up with an answer to those questions?
No. I don't necessarily feel like I ever have a good answer to those questions. I know that like the older I get, the more place feels fated. So thinking about fate as being what limits us, like we were born to this family and we were born in this place, we can't change that. So fate is kind of what limits you and what you can't change. I'm never going to be. Last night I dreamt, since we were talking about dreams, last night I dreamt that there was an AI program that could make anybody look to other people the way they wanted to look. And so I was sort of playing with this program and I was like, let's see what it's like to be like this 6 foot tall supermodel because I'm 5'1". And so like, I'm never going to be a 6 foot tall supermodel, but I was able to do that through this AI program, which is such a weird dream. But my height is something that is fated. Like that limits me. Like they say, you can be whatever you want to be. I'm never going to be a 6 foot tall supermodel. There's lots that I can't be. Right. So, and I always think about place feels fated too. Like, even though I could technically choose to be wherever I wanted to be, it doesn't really, when I go back and look at my life story, it doesn't really feel like I did a lot of that. Like there was choosing to travel and things, but in terms of where I was living, I was often, kind of rooted in a place and had to stay there for certain reasons that had to do with other people. So the where feels like fate. Why here? That feels like something that is fated. Do I have a good answer for, why I have lived in Pennsylvania most of my life? No, I don't, but I feel like there must be one. I don't know what it is, but I feel like there must be one.
Yeah. It's such an interesting, I like to do this. My partner and I will often kind of walk backwards in terms of where we find ourselves today and what led us here. And it's like, we'll follow those breadcrumbs backward and we'll be like, well, yeah, that wouldn't have happened unless this happened. And then this wouldn't have happened unless that happened. And we'll go all the way back to the beginning of when we met each other. And that to some extent also feels fated. Like if I hadn't just come back from studying abroad and been interested in the international student program and had my eyes open to different cultures and different worlds and languages, then I wouldn't have had this conversation with him in an International Student Association meeting, and then everything just snowballs from there. So I find that just fate itself an interesting topic of conversation.
Yeah.
So
I know. I drag my kids to go watch It's a Wonderful Life every year because we have this really cool movie theater across the street from our house, and I feel like it's fun to do that, and they also hate it, and so I feel like that's fun for me to make them go see it. But we were there this year, and there was a man that was there who is kind of the reason why my husband moved from Portland, Oregon to the East Coast. So I wouldn't have met him if this random guy hadn't been a part of that. And he was there at the movie. And I was like, if that guy hadn't been born, we'd never met. Like if he was like George Bailey and had never been born, none of this would be happening right now. And that was a real like, whoa moment. Like how it really is. Like your life affects so many other people.
yeah,
It's almost
Portland,
like there has to be a grand design.
Yeah, it certainly feels like that way, especially when I walk it backwards. And you say Portland, Oregon, and I'm sitting right across the water from Portland right now.
Oh, wow.
There's a serendipity. One more thing about archetypes, and then I want to shift to a different topic. But I wanted, in lieu of this year, to me, I said at the beginning of the podcast, feels like a big year. For us in this country, it's an election year. For a lot of other countries, it's also an election year. I know Mexico has a big election coming up all across the globe. It feels like, what's going to happen? Oh my gosh. I'm like on the edge of my seat, biting my fingernails over here. So, and I don't know, it feels just, I was listening to Trevor Noah talk about this, and I felt like I resonated with what he said in terms of it feels like I've been afraid of elections before, but I haven't been afraid in terms of like there being this sense of possible violence around an election year.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if we were to use, and like I said, this book to me, Bones and Honey, is like a resource, a reference book for kind of like any stage that you or any circumstance that you're finding yourself in life. And I'm thinking about, what do you think about the archetype being most important for our world today in this particular climate that we find ourselves in?
Yeah. Well, I think the wounded healer is probably the most important archetype for the world. And I think that maybe that's especially true for people that identify as healers, but also maybe not. Maybe it's important for everyone to at least explore what the wounded healer archetype would mean. Because yeah, I think I think we're still just at the very, very beginning. I had this download at the beginning of COVID. Well, not the beginning of COVID, but the beginning of quarantine in March of 2020, where I was sort of in this, it's a hypnopompic state when you're waking up from sleep. And I just heard this voice say, the humanity has come 1 inch out of 100 million miles. And I just thought, like, wow, that is not very far. And so if we're just at the beginning of that and we're sort of, not even at the once upon a time yet, then of course it's going to be gnarly because birth is gnarly. So I think, the wounded healer, the medicine is in the wound in that archetype. And so, and I think that that'll take on different shapes as we go through the coming year and beyond. But for now, it's thinking about like individually, where is the medicine in your wound? We all have a deep sacred wound. And so, it's not necessarily trying to stitch it up and ignore it. It's letting it ache and letting it bleed and trying to find, trying to honor the wound as much as you would honor your gifts. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that for now. But
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's going to be a gnarly year. I have this knowing that I don't share often because not everybody receives it well, but I just don't feel like I'm going to in my lifetime see the end or like see like the great wrap up or the ever after to this story. Like I don't think that I'm going to necessarily die when the world is good again or something, and I'm okay with that. So, I'm here right now to try to witch what I can from the inside and see a lot of the systems that I don't agree with crumble. I hope I get to see that. But do I get to see the great rebirth and the coming dawn? I don't know that I do. And I think that's okay. Like, you know, I have this long vision. I hope my children get to see it, or my grandchildren, or my great 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 grandchildren. But I'm okay not necessarily knowing how it all ends in this incarnation. Because
Yeah.
if it ended quickly, it wouldn't be as good.
Yeah. Or lasting. I wonder about sustainability when something that has taken so long to be built up and is so ingrained in our society over hundreds and hundreds of years, the crumbling that seems to take a long time. I feel like this has been a long time coming. And so I think you're right. The building back up, I think, is going to take, I don't know if it needs to be just as long, but I think it takes maybe decades. I don't know if it's hundreds of years, but that when you were saying that, there's something about like, okay, I can handle that if it's for a purpose, if it's for a greater good. And that made me feel a little bit more at peace when you were saying that. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So the word witch, the BBC put out this, I think it was a 13-part series, 13 for a reason, on I think it's just called Witch, and it's like a podcast series. Have you heard of this?
No, I don't think so.
It was quite interesting. And so the person that was hosting the interviews went around to the world and talked to many different witches from all over the world, and age brackets and socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think what they were trying to get at was defining the witch. And also doing more investigative journalism in terms of like, well, there's not just one answer. It's not a linear path, and there's not one right definition. And so I was curious about how you would define the word witch, and if that has evolved for you over the years. Has it stayed constant? Yeah, I wanted to hear you talk about that.
It stayed constant just because my definition is relatively simple. I think that you're a witch if you meet both of two conditions. The first is you identify as a witch. I think that if you don't claim that name for yourself and somebody else is calling you a witch, that there's just no way it could be true. You have to claim that name for yourself. And that also you practice witchcraft, but that can look, what does it mean to practice witchcraft? That's a whole other question. It can look any number of ways. I think that practice of witchcraft very much ebbs and flows. And I know plenty of witches, especially, my age and older, who they don't necessarily practice witchcraft every day anymore, or even every moon cycle anymore. It's something that's kind of there when they need it and when they don't need it. And it might be years that they don't feel like they need it. Then, they're still practicing it technically, even though it isn't this, very rigid, disciplined thing necessarily. And of course, some witches need it to be versus others don't necessarily. But that doesn't mean that they're not witches just because they're not like actively tending their altar every single day either. So yeah, you identify as a witch and you practice witchcraft, whatever that means for you.
Yeah. Well, in the practicing of the witchcraft, I had a more specific question about the chapters in the books, or they're called books within the book. And they're these prayers for basically anything. And I was curious about the use of the word prayer versus something like spell, or I think I was curious about that specific word prayer versus something like spell. And I just wanted to hear you talk about what prayer means to you, why that, maybe you want to talk about the etymology of prayer.
Yes, I always do. So prayer means the earnest request. And so we might think of prayer as similar, but a little bit different from a charm in witchcraft, where a charm, if you were speaking that like some kind of an incantation, you would want to consider where it's going. So that's similar with a prayer. You don't have to necessarily be praying to a deity. You could be praying to your ancestors or your own wise and future self, sending the prayer to yourself in the future or in the past. as something that could be like a healing elixir, but thinking about an earnest request or a petition, but like to whom, like where is that going? And so it would be similar to a charm in witchcraft, where you consider like, okay, this is going to go to this particular deity that I work with, or this is going to go to my ancestors or descendants, etc. So that, and then also the word prayer for sure has a lot of tension around it. I mean, especially with witches, I know that for me, kind of re-befriending the word prayer was something necessary and tricky, because I was raised pretty strict born again Christian for the first 12 or so years of my life. And so I memorized all of the different types of prayer, in terms of the Christian tradition, and then what that looked like and what that meant, and had to really kind of divorce myself from that and then let it live as something else, as I got deeper into witchcraft in my early 20s. But we still need prayer. We all have earnest requests. It's just they might be landing in different places than deity necessarily.
Yeah. Thank you. I love the etymology of that word, earnest request.
Yeah,
So
an
cool.
earnest request.
I'm glad we talked about that. So you have so many books under your belt, Bones and Honey being the latest. I was curious to hear, why this book, why now, and maybe a little bit how it differs from your other works.
Yeah, it is very well. I guess all my books are different, but this one was especially different to write from the other books. I have some prayers that are in Bones and Honey that I wrote, or at least started to write, many years ago. So even though I kind of stitched the book together maybe a bit quicker than my other books, I have been writing Bones and Honey for probably the longest amount of time. There's prayers in there that I maybe wrote in even 2015. So that was a while ago. But yeah, why now? Well, I've been wanting to write a prayer book, and it just kind of seemed like I needed to say and do other things first before I was ready to put it together. And then also, like, the real motivation or inspiration behind Bones and Honey, that I was definitely brewing at this time last year when I was the weeping snow hag in my snow cocoon, was what are the archetypes that are medicinal? So what feels, if an archetype is a bubble of energy, what what is most needed right now as we're going into 2024 and beyond. So thinking about each of the 13 archetypes in Bones and Honey, that was what I was thinking at this time last year. That's where the elixir is. If there's a way that these archetypes can be amplified through art, even this tiny contribution of a heathen prayer book, then a little bit of the power in those archetypes, like the wounded healer, comes back into the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, gosh, I had another question, and I hope it comes back to me, because I was like, oh, I really want to remember to ask her this. But since that slipped out of my mind, I wanted to ask about the difference, the first two books, and I'm not sure if these are in chronological order, but the Holy Wild and the Holy Wild Grimoire. Oh, I remember the other question. Let me ask you really quick before it slips away again. Altars.
Yeah.
So if someone is never had an altar, doesn't know how to set one up, things like where it should be in the house, if it should be facing a particular direction, items to be on it, how to create an altar for someone that hasn't done it before.
Yeah. So I usually recommend starting with two altars if you can, and one of them is your ancestral altar. And I know that there's a whole world around the ancestors and tension around working with them and that, but you could just have a simple altar to the deep medicines in your four grandparental lines. So it's looking at what you know of them, and I know that a lot of lineages might be in mystery, but what you know of them, if you go back to the earth-based tradition that is housed in that lineage, can you put something on your altar that represents that? So you don't necessarily have to have pictures of the dead people that you know on your ancestral altar. You would be representing the deep medicine of the lineages that live in you, because really you are the breathing ancestral altar. So I recommend having that, but that's not necessarily a working altar for spellcraft, just because eventually you might have pictures of your beloved dead on there, and they might. There's a lot of tension around that. Like, I have a pretty elaborate ancestral altar, and I have Catholic things on there because I have my whole mother line is Irish, and so I have Mother Mary on there. But she's not somebody that I work with in my witchcraft. I have some pictures of people on my ancestral altar that wouldn't love that I am a witch. So that's not a working altar that I use when I'm casting spells. So an ancestral altar, if that resonates. And then your working altar, I don't like to have it near the front door. I do have altars where people can see them if they come into my house. So that's not something that bothers me. I know other people might put them in a cabinet or something so they don't get messed with. I don't live with people that would mess with my altars at this point. But if I did, I would definitely put them away. And then just, the bare bones would be representing the 4 elements. So you can have a dish of water, a dish of dirt or clay, or even a stone to represent earth. Then you can have some incense or sacred smoke, or even a feather to represent the air element, and then some ashes or candle to represent fire. And then you do want to tend it. So you do want to change the water, or not let the water go dry. You would want to burn the incense every so often. So that would be just, bare bones, how to have an altar. But yeah, you can go from there. So, whatever your big power source might be, and that doesn't have to be a deity. If you love the wounded healer archetype, the wounded healer can be a power source. So you would represent that with an object on your altar. Yeah.
Cool. I love that. Good to know, not by the door.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense to me. It just feels intuitive, but I hadn't thought of that until I heard you say that. But the idea of having 2 altars, a working altar and an ancestral altar, that's one I had not heard before. So I like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll go back to the question I was going to ask before about, well, I think the question is more about Grimoire, because I think many of us might already know what that is. Some of us might not be completely sure. And so maybe it's a 2-part question. The book that you wrote, The Holy Wild, and then The Holy Wild Grimoire, are they companions? Are they meant to go together? Are they 2 completely separate things? And then can we define Grimoire?
Yeah. They are meant to go together. However, the original intention was I was going to write a companion journal for The Holy Wild. And then it did sort of end up taking on a life of its own. So I know that many people have read The Holy Wild Grimoire that haven't read The Holy Wild, and it's still fine. It's essentially The Holy Wild Grimoire. So grimoire means grammar. That's the etymology of grimoire. And so we might think of grimoire as being a book of spells, and it is, but it's really about like word witchery and your own writing, and using writing as a practice for divination and spell work. There's ways to manifest through writing, especially if writing is your primary art. Whenever you weave your own primary art into your witchcraft is that much more amplified. So if you identify as a writer or a poet, then the Holy Wild Grimoire is about, working with your own grammar, using that loosely, actually breaking a lot of rules around academic grammar, but using your own writing as a tool for oracular seership, and then also manifestation, and sometimes so other forms of spell work.
Okay. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So one last question for you. We've talked a lot about Bones and Honey, and we brought up The Holy Wild and The Holy Wild Grimoire. For those listeners that are familiar with your work, and for those listening to you for the first time on this podcast, any key takeaways, anything, if this is their first touch with you that you want to make sure it sticks, what would you say?
To make sure it sticks. Yes. Well, my go-to sort of like advice for life, but especially, if you're thinking about, beginning to walk the path of the witch or amplify your witchcraft path that you're already on, I always recommend people go back through their life story and look at the moments from childhood and beyond where they really felt like they were fiercely present and the most them they could possibly be. Like in that one fleeting moment in time when I was looking at that waterfall, or I was watching the sunrise, or I was dancing with that person, in that one moment, not like I was happy for 5 years when I lived there. It's like a fleeting moment in time. In that moment, I was so fully present, body, mind, spirit yoked together. I was so right there. If you name enough of those, and it takes a little bit, it takes a few hours, but I don't really recommend doing it all at once necessarily. But to look at all of your life chapters and name those moments, you can always find patterns. So you can always see like, oh wow, I'm always with other people in these moments. I'm always alone in these moments. It's often morning or it's often the middle of the night. You can really, and it's individual for everybody. It's really unique. You can see the elements that are dominant or the art that might be dominant. And you can see that that's probably orienting you toward what your unique path as, a witch or a healer, or however you want to identify, whatever your spiritual practice might be. Those moments and the patterns within them, they really help you track like the next steps and where you're going. You can see really clearly what your personal myth is if you look at those fleeting moments in time when you really felt like you were the most you could possibly be.
Ooh, that's such a good one. Thank you so much, Danielle. Oh, what a joy to speak with you. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. What's your favorite way to connect with people?
So my website is danielledulsky.com or thehagschool.com. So that's probably the easiest way. I'm on Instagram as wolfwomanwitch, but I'm pretty bad at connecting with people on Instagram.
Fair enough. You froze there right at the last one. You're saying I'm pretty bad at connecting with people on Instagram, and then you like threw your head back, and that's great.
That's how bad I am. It's just free.
It's like the truth. Yes, sister. Yes. Danielle, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't, be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic musical genius, Drew Lovern. Thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.